All right, good afternoon. Welcome back. My name's Troy Whitney. I'm a Client Services Director for Network to Code. And our afternoon panel this afternoon is going to discuss enterprise transformation with network automation. So I'm delighted to have our guest speakers here on the panel today. We have Mr. Aryo Kresnadi, who's a Technical Director at FedEx Services. We have Mr. Jay Moran, who's a Senior Vice President of Platform Engineering at Fiserv. And we have Mr. Matthew Elphick, who's Director at Marsh and McLennan. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today.
Thanks, Troy.
Thank you.
So let's just kick off here. And I'd like to ask you, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal journey with network automation. Aryo, maybe you'd like to go first?
Okay, so thank you, Troy. I guess thank you everybody to join this place. Actually, it's kind of nice to be able to share this knowledge for sure. Okay, who am I? I guess been with FedEx for, I guess Troy asking earlier, 20 years. My role in FedEx basically managing the strategy of where we're going into the networking area. When you're talking about the wide area network, local area network, anything related with network. Personal journey in terms of network automation. Actually, what we earlier discussing, actually, that start early enough that three things that we try to do with network automation. It's always about speed. Basically, that's the big one. Why people want to automate the network. There is no such thing as enough, basically, manpower and resources. The other thing that we also look actually in the journey of me basically learning is always try to get into more consistencies. So that's actually the big thing that we always looking, my personal journey, try to do the network automation since day one in FedEx. So until my roles right now, try to create the strategy that basically growing basically the network up.
Thank you. And Jay, how about you?
Right. Jay Moran with Fiserv. I run what's called platform engineering here, which component of is networks. We also do all of the, up through the operating system database design and engineering, all the virtualization layers and other componentry, security, load balancing, things like that. So personal journey with automation for me started back in probably right before 2000 when I was at AOL. So before I came to Fiserv. So that was for myself, network engineer at the time, using Perl to do conversions from, Bay networks over to Cisco, config conversions, SNMP polls. That's where it really started for me. As I kind of moved into management, the team itself really picked it up. So at AOL, we wrote a lot of our stuff, probably, early 2000s, a lot of Python with Twisted Framework and a few other things. So watch the team do it. I am a horrible network automator myself, but certainly want to make sure the team can do the things to make them most efficient and let them, get more done. It's really what it comes down to. Back to Aryo's comment is the ability to do more things faster as well as more efficiently and really turn the turnaround times for our people who are requesting things in the network pretty vital for us.
Did you find in your time at AOL, was that a grassroots effort to bring network automation to AOL, or was it top down?
Yeah, very much so. We had a couple of fortunate events that, we created a CMDB that a lot of us, I don't think appreciated nearly enough until after we kind of moved to other companies, but it really gave us the basis to do a lot of that. So that source of truth from a very early point, it was really around the systems themselves, but as we added more network componentry in there, it was very important. Firewalling actually was probably the first real thing that on the network side, when you have 3 or 4 different vendors of firewalls and ACLs, we used a lot of access control lists on routers. To manage that manually is pretty much impossible. So we at the time had ACL lengths in the millions of lines of Cisco ACL terms, for example, that had to be managed. And so when you join that across multi-vendors, it was kind of a natural thing for those teams to create. And that was really the basis for a lot of it. So grassroots, but completely supported once we saw the advantages.
Got it. Thank you. Matthew, how about you?
Thanks, Troy. I've been in networking for about 20 years, various different roles across operations and engineering. I've always worked for large enterprises, generally in financial services, so previously at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. I've been at Marsh and McLennan now for 3.5 years, currently working as the Network Operations Director. So MMC, in case anybody doesn't know what it is, another large enterprise, world's largest insurance broker, 4 different business units with lots of different sort of requirements from the network, 800 locations, 75,000 people. But my first step in network automation was writing a Perl script, I think much like a lot of people, just to help me do my day-to-day job. So, run some pre and post checkouts on some devices. Since then, used a lot of different tools, open source, off-the-shelf licensed stuff as well, to help, automate and efficiently manage the network. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. That sounds great. One of my first questions for you all, I think one of the things we'd like to tackle on the panel here today is for folks who haven't been as far down the journey as all of you with, kicking off network automation, growing it with their teams. From an organizational and cultural perspective, sometimes old habits can stand in the way of adopting new ways of doing things, right? And we all know network automation brings quite a bit of change in how people can go about their daily lives. So I'm curious to ask each of you, as you begin to go down these journeys, both places you have been and places you are now, what have you done to try to overcome some of those old habits and encourage people that it's okay to rethink how they do things that are different than how they might have done them before network automation was part of your organization? Maybe Jay, would you like to go first?
I'm sure. Yeah, I think I never know why people say it, but I think early on, at least network automation, the first thing that anyone would ever say that hasn't done it before, more command line type folks, is, well, that just sounds like a really fast way to crash and destroy your entire network. And it's like, yeah, don't do that. That's like rule 1 is let's not just go try and do things across the entire network without testing in the lab first. So that cultural piece is hard to overcome in a lot of cases, right? Because just a fact of life, a lot of people actually maybe did computer science in college or along their career paths in IT, and decided it wasn't for them, right? And so when you say the word automation, it comes with programming generally, and that coding aspect of it isn't what some people enjoy to do day to day. So I think a lot of it is a gut reaction of, that doesn't sound like what I want to do. I like networking. I like working with BGP or OSPF or ISIS. I like those protocol things. And I do too, right? But I think the thing to overcome culturally is, look, first off, it is a way to not have to do the repetitive task again and again and again, right? I hope most people don't like doing that repetitive stuff many times. My favorite is like an XKCD little cartoon, which is about, how many times do you have to do a task and how long does that task take before, X amount of hours of working on automation will pay yourself back for it, right? And while it's a cartoon and it's supposed to be tongue in cheek, it's actually pretty accurate too. So for those things that you do, 2, 3, 4 times a week, showing those gains, simple gains, right, for team members has often worked for me to overcome the cultural, no, we don't want to do it like that here, and show people, look, you can get a lot of advantage and you can do more things yourself. You can spend more time working on kind of the harder, bigger problems of how do you scale your network, or how do you reconfigure it or swap out, one tech for another tech without people noticing. So that's really the thing for me that buys people over to my side.
So it sounds like you can tell people you still get to work on the cool stuff. You just only have to do it fewer times and not repetitively. Is that part of it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks. Matthew, how about you?
Sort of from an old habits or cultural perspective, one of the things to draw out would be around standards. So in order to automate anything, we need to really think about what the standards are for how we're going to deploy things. And in all of the organizations I've worked in, there have been various different groups that, for good reasons, historical reasons, have grown up with their own standards. So maybe it's split regionally or along some other kind of technology line. But working together to come up with sort of consistent standards that everyone's comfortable with, that everyone's happy with, gives you a much better foundation from which you can then go on to automate other things. So in terms of trying to shift that culture a little bit, our approach was to sort of start relatively small and focus on things that were achievable. So break things up into smaller blocks, start with management standards or OS standards, rather than saying we're going to standardize everything and everything must come through this committee or whatever it happens to be. Rather than be too dogmatic about everything, look at the things that are going to actually help us manage the network, and try and focus on those small gains first. So I think that helped provide a bit of a shift in that mentality across the firm.
So speaking of committees, I think one of the things that often comes up is like a change management board, right? Do you find yourself reclassifying changes that should be able to be pushed through with automation versus changes that should be manually reviewed, or how have you sort of sliced and diced that yourself?
Yes, we've had that conversation with our sort of change management team, and the policies and processes were put in place several years ago before technology caught up. So it just makes sense to sort of review that and try and come up with some compromise, because obviously there needs to be some sort of change control that makes sense. And so the compromise we sort of landed on was more around defining more carefully the things that we could push more quickly with automation and getting those sort of approved up front. And then rather than having to get lots and lots of different approvals every time you wanted to do something, if it was doing something that had been tested properly and was gone through a sort of pilot phase, then it was a lighter touch from a change control perspective.
And from your point about standardization, if it's something that's already been run through before successfully, the risk of a problem is probably lower, I imagine.
Well, we're working with computers and networks, anything can happen, but yeah, that's the theory.
Thank you. And Aryo, how about you?
Actually, what Jay and Matt actually kind of going through is almost the same, but let's start a bit different. I think perspective that I have when we're talking about old habit, and it's what Jay mentioned, we program since day one. The difference is there is what is called the sysadmin perspective. There is basically the programming perspective. Some of why we split up, I guess, in the 80s or 90s. If you're looking into networking in the beginning, actually no different than routing control in terms of the server itself or kind of that host model. So fast forward multiple years later, the concept of basically automation coming back to the network because of it's actually there, but because of like what Matt mentioned, isn't it? When we're talking about in FedEx, we got a lot of legacy. We acquire a lot of company. Consistency is not there. So that is when we're talking about try to overcome the habit is really, number one, the big one is literally that the concept of network is different. It's a lot of things that we say like network is different than the host, than the DevOps and so on. So what we did basically in the beginning of days, starting the journey actually when the rethink is always in my mind is the whole concept of software defined. It's funny and interesting because at that time, we already use software in the network except in the multiple ways, multiple vendors, multiple everything. So when we're talking about that journey, it's really in terms of how to create like what Matt mentioned to standardization. There's one line. Then basically the next line that we try to create some kind of concept about, keep joking, we're not the best buy of the world buying every electronic gadget known to man. How about we start creating more a structure environment? Then from that, we go into basically the DevSecOps model. Is we follow what basically the agile process. We create what is called the Cloud Dojo for the application developer. We also involve basically through education, through basically the idea that we are not different in the networking world. So by doing that, hopefully that we are in the journey the same way, because one thing that hard to create a closed loop environment is try to open it. So at the end of the day for the business, we are actually reaching the same thing, isn't it? Try to gain the business or basically make the business more efficient. So that's kind of what we are trying to do in that multiple habit problem. It's kind of like what we're doing.
So you mentioned the journey. I'd like to extend on that a little bit, because so often as techies like we are, we love the technology. We love to talk about, the different pieces that are available. But ultimately, when we talk about bringing transformation like this to large enterprises, it's very much about people, right? So from a consulting standpoint, there's the traditional people process technology. I'm curious to hear from each of you. The people part of the equation is so critical to actually bringing about change to these large enterprises. What sorts of things have you done to bring your people along on the journey when you're introducing network automation and the initiatives to your teams? What do you do to make them embrace the change and not possibly dread or be distracted from the change? Matt, would you like to go first?
Sure. So one of the things that we tried to think about was, how is this actually going to help people do their job? That kind of sounds obvious, but there's a good chance if you help someone do their day-to-day job, it's going to align well with the other priorities for your business anyway. So rather than looking at things from a sort of device or configuration perspective, we sort of looked at things a bit more from a workflow perspective. So in talking to some of the engineers, it became obvious that some of our onboarding processes were quite painful. Lots of forms need to be filled in, DNS updates, TACAC servers to be updated. So trying to figure out how to automate some of those workflows was going to help us a great deal. But we also, from a network automation, from more of a strategy point of view, wanted to get more people used to the idea of a source of truth, managing the configurations and the processes through the source of truth. And so in focusing on these specific workflows, we managed to get the team more used to using the source of truth, putting information into the source of truth, getting things updated that way. The benefits then to them were they'd had to do less of the annoying stuff that they didn't really like doing, but we started to get more information, more configuration data in the source of truth that then subsequently has helped us with other automation initiatives down the road. So, focusing a bit more on the workflows, how is this going to help the team on a day-to-day basis, rather than just what does it take to configure 1,000 devices in an afternoon?
Okay. Aryo, how about you?
It's actually exactly what Matt mentioned, adding in the sense that basically number one is really what is for themselves. And the people side, people actually exactly what's the most important one, because if you don't get the buy-in, if you don't get anything, that's the hardest thing to move forward with a lot of stuff in it. Back into my earlier comment, network is different. How do you start making the automation is for them? What Matt mentioned earlier, one thing that removing the workload, dividing the workload that I think earlier, Jay, you mentioned too, isn't it? That some people really doesn't like to be the programmer forever. So one thing that we do, we combine basically tooling and automation too. One thing big that I heard from, I think one of the two guys that I've been working with for a while is really that it's not really about the programming piece, but mostly how do you convey the message? Because sometimes the hard one for us as an engineer too, we know how to do it ourselves. However, when you start talking about automation, there is a process. How do you replicate that one step into 1,000 capabilities? So we're talking about talking like a programmer, probably really the biggest one that we try to educate to, because some people are really good about the BGP, what the routing, they will be going that way forever. While the other one will be try to get, like what Matt mentioned earlier, if they like to be the programmer, there is what is really for you. Creating the efficiency. Validation is always, in my mind, the big one that we have to go through, rather than going the big start into more building an automation 10-1. The starting by validate what the mundane job. Configuring 1,000 router, about validation first. That how to overcome the people, isn't it? If you give them that capability that make them more basically happy and then get less workload, it will be helping them to start thinking there is something about basically automation.
Okay. And Jay, how about you?
I'll take a little different tack. I mean, certainly making it personal is very, very important, but also, it's, I come from more internet-based companies before I came to Fiserv. Fiserv's financial services, so both card payments on the First Data side, which is the other half of the company, and original Fiserv, which is who bought First Data a year back, and that's more on banking, traditional small, medium-sized banks, credit unions, things like that, electronic payments. So, the enterprise idea here that I try to bring to the team is what's possible, right? It took a while to get people to see what's possible, right? Because if you've never done something before, you've never even seen it, it's almost, you can't realize what you could do, right? Because you haven't actually had that in front of you. So fortunately, I came from places that was grassroots. We created it so I can tell about my experiences, but my experiences don't always translate for this enterprise industry. And so bringing in some people from other, other companies to talk to us, or even hiring them. In a few cases, we've certainly hired some network automation folks into the teams, and then letting them work with the team members and talk about, hey, what we can do, how we can do it. The next piece is, back to the point of, I hate harping on it, but like not everyone has to write Python code to make this kind of work. But people do have to think systematically and more logical, and kind of like, if you can distill what your thing is, what you do every day, what your work is, then that helps us kind of organize that in a place where we can say this can be automated or can't be. There's a great article in Computer Magazine, Always Be Automating, ABA. I sign a lot of my emails with ABA. And if you haven't read it before, it's basically the tale of two sysadmins in this case. One who, like takes the time to write down what he does, thinking about how he could automate it, just concentrating on it. The other one who says, well, I want to automate because I'll get more done, but continuously puts it off. And so the process of automating starts well before you actually write that first line of code or figure out how to, combine this into a configuration management tool or whatever it is. It happens every day with what you do. And so that's what I try to make sure everybody realizes. An automation mindset doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the one inside of, all the different tool sets that we're kind of bringing together. So hopefully that can help people just realize if you can't imagine what's possible, then it's really hard to see what you can do with automation until you start looking around, investigating, watching videos, hearing what other people are doing. And then I think it really wow, that's something we could do.
And it's often collaborative. It's not just in your own sort of, one person who has to write it down and that same person's doing the programming. This is a team effort. There are experts who know what the process currently is, and there are experts who are great at writing Python or whatever it happens to be. So figuring out how you can get those two or more people working together is really key to this as well.
I was going to ask, even beyond encouraging people to embrace the change and get excited about what's possible with automation, many times with automation, we're rethinking the old way of doing things. And where I'm headed with that is so many times, especially in large enterprises, you can run into the resistance of, well, we got to do it this way. And if you ask them why, I'm not sure why, but that's the way we've always done it. We got to do it this way. How do you all encourage people to rethink how we've always done it? That it's okay to question, why are we doing that? Could we make that a faster process or automate that or eliminate a manual step? Anybody on the panel here, how would you tackle that type of built-in, cultural mindset?
First, you can't tell people no, and you gotta trust that they're going to make mistakes and have their backs, especially as leaders. Trying to encourage this, that mistakes will happen, and when they do, let's make sure, first off, use logic and reason for what you're going to do. Right? If you can explain what it is you're trying to accomplish, and I can't find a fault in kind of, you just didn't go willy-nilly like a cowboy and do it. You can cause a lot of damage with automation if you're doing that. But if you have the logic and reason, and something does pop up. I think Matthew mentioned it earlier. It's like something always seems to go wrong somewhere. So you always have to be prepared for that. But back your people up and say, okay, well, we're going to learn from this, celebrate that that failure, make sure a lot of people hear about it, and try to repeat the same mistakes. But I think that's the biggest thing, is just making sure people understand that oh, I made a mistake. You're not gone. It's, oh, you made a mistake. Let's make sure we don't make that one again for everybody.
I think it's
Go ahead.
It's good to look for opportunities as well. Necessity is the mother of invention. We've had situations where, security vulnerabilities come up. Remediation is going to require a lot of config work to be done quickly. And, at that point, if you've done some preparation and you've got some systems in place and you've worked on a sort of framework that can help you with that, that's a good opportunity to make a little shift or redirect a process or something like that, so that you can start to, be a bit more aggressive with some of your automation, if you're actually going to, get something done that's critical to management.
Yeah, finding the sweet spot, I think, in terms of looking into the idea that number one, I think basically backing it up, and then actually it is at the end of the day sometimes that we try to do too exactly is about that. If people asking you, but we've been doing this forever, what does that means? But more importantly, try to change the mindset. Is about if you have a sweet spot about. Again, the sweet spot sometimes doesn't have to be, the big thing. You start by the small times a lot. We started the journey a couple of years ago by building the team, number one, to create an example. Second, basically, we start dividing into multiple swim lanes, that one of them actually just building the source of truth. Because literally part of the deal to build automation is to find the source of truth. Because as a legacy enterprise like we got so many. And then the problem is become a complaint. We have so many standards. They don't want to fix it, except they basically everybody we keep complaining every Friday. We call it a Friday complaining session. We call it. So, but when we start moving forward, creating that swim lane, use the automation through a tooling. There's another thing. Give. I think if we get the winning early, I guess what Matt mentioned about ITIL, isn't it? They already got the standard changes in ITIL. It's not really ITIL change. No, the challenge is we sometimes go to the right, to the left, because like what Jay mentioned, the big outage. When you got the big outage, we understand in the enterprise, we go swing it to the right, swing it to the left. That is the balancing act. And then when you basically try to help the team, it's always that it's okay. What Jay mentioned, we do the same thing. Yes.
I think I've heard all three of you mention source of truth and how important that is as the first step in the journey. I've heard some interesting stories about ways to try to enforce a source of truth, such as if somebody goes and makes a change outside of the source of truth, maybe use automation to back it out, right? To make sure things always match the source of truth. Have any of you implemented policies like that in your organization?
No, we haven't been that strict yet. We've looked at, I think initially when we started to deploy a source of truth, we're using NetBox, by the way, I sort of possibly naively expected we'll just do some training, tell everybody to use the source of truth, and that'll be the end of that. But it's certainly been more complicated. And I think that goes back to some of the thinking about workflows. How is this actually going to help people on a day-to-day basis? If we want them to put in the effort of helping us, because it's not just down to a network automation team, it's got to be an effort across the organization to maintain that information and manage those processes, then we need to explain how it's going to benefit them. And then also going back to being slightly opportunistic is then looking at specific projects that maybe you can really start to use the source of truth to do the full automation. So we were going to do a refresh of our branch environment, and that meant moving to sort of SD-WAN type environment. And so that was an opportunity to make sure we had clear standards and processes to build the source of truth up front off the back of those standards. And then once you've got the data and the standards, you can then automate off the back of that. And we did a collaboration with Network to Code on putting that in place. Now, still, that's not perfect. There's still lots of examples where we need to deploy environments that don't match those standards and things aren't quite right. And so we don't really have, it wouldn't make sense in our environment to be too dogmatic about it. But it certainly helped us move in the right direction in that journey.
Okay.
I was just going to, pretty quick is just when I look at this source of truth, again, I came from a place where we created it ourselves and it became kind of our operating model. So it wasn't really just a CMDB. It was also the operating platform for, you didn't build a VM, you defined a VM inside of Orb is what our tool was called. And then that created the process to do it. And so we kind of started from that is what it really ended up from or started at. But I think when you look at a journey of taking what you have and kind of building into it, it's like back to it's like you're not immediately going to go remediate any changes that you're noticing, but your source of truth should be updated regularly, hopefully as often as you can do it, whatever that periodicity is. But you verify and tell people, hey, look, I'm out of date. You've made a change somewhere that doesn't exist that should, this piece of information should only update the automation. And then after that, eventually you get to the point where it's auto remediated. But then the real goal is to say, look, I've defined, this service and these entitlements. And then that mapping is what's true, right? And so the creation of the automation happens based on the definition of, who needs to access what or what needs to happen. And then that's what's actually deployed. So I look at it as, 3-4 steps of a journey from source of truth to really the source of what actually makes the actions happen.
And then
So,
one area that we've been on that journey of source of truth is really back into that. How do you help the engineer? We start early days creating our own in-house source of truth. We are in the journey to go into the NetBox, basically model 2. It's really to create into the 2 model, expanding basically the capabilities too, because in the beginning days, it's really that the engineer will be willing more to basically become the participant in terms of updating because there is a benefit for them. And the first thing I remember the day that we start building that is only just get a website that basically telling them, putting it here, and then we do all the magic, we call it. We do all the automation behind it. And in the case of NetBox, we try to solve also the problem, for example, where is in the rack unit we are putting the system? What is the subnet? What is the IPAM that we're going? It's really not even production looks alike, but if you think in the long run, Basically, it will help building the basic. We have the plan, what is called API first. So by doing that, we put it on the network first, thinking about that. Let's think about API rather than CLI, but doesn't mean CLI died, but it's just going to that journey.
Wonderful. I know we're in the last couple seconds here. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank all three of you for your participation today and sharing your insights. I think that's one way that the community grows is by learning from those that have gone before us, and we really appreciate all three of you taking the time today. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good rest of the Interop show. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.